In the desert outside Aswan, in southern Egypt, there's a piece of stone that never went anywhere. It's still attached to the bedrock it was cut from, exactly where the workers left it roughly 3,500 years ago, mid-project, tools down, and never came back. If it had been finished, it would have been the largest obelisk ever raised by ancient Egypt, heavier than 1,000 tons of solid granite. Instead, it's a ghost of a monument, half carved into a trench in the rock, and the tool marks running down its sides are still sharp enough to photograph today. By the end of this video, you'll understand how ancient Egyptians actually cut granite, one of the hardest, most stubborn stones on the planet, without iron tools. And why? Even with that explained, this specific object still raises a question nobody has fully closed. Subscribe before we go in, because this is one of the strangest unfinished projects left standing anywhere in the ancient world. Start with why this stone was such a serious problem in the first place. Granite sits at roughly 6 to 7 on the Mohs hardness scale, hard enough that even with modern power tools, cutting it cleanly is genuinely difficult work. Ancient Egypt, during the era this quarry was active, had no iron tools capable of cutting granite directly. Bronze is softer than granite. Copper is softer still. On paper, that should have made large-scale granite quarrying close to impossible. It obviously wasn't, because granite obelisks, granite sarcophagi, and granite temple facings exist all over Egypt, which means the real question was never whether they cut it, but how. The long-accepted answer, and it's held up better under testing than a lot of people assume, involves a stone called dolerite, sometimes called diorite, in older sources, which is harder than granite, and was shaped into fist-sized pounding balls. Workers used these dolerite pounders to literally batter the surrounding granite away, over and over, in a slow process of controlled pulverization, rather than cutting in the way we normally think of a blade cutting. It sounds almost too simple for the results, so in the early 2000s, Egyptologist Dennis Stocks ran a real, published series of experimental archaeology trials to actually test it using authentic dolerite pounders on real granite, timing the work and comparing the resulting surface to genuine ancient tool marks. And it worked. Stocks was able to reproduce recognizable Egyptian-style dressing marks using nothing but dolerite balls and sustained human effort, confirming that the basic method the textbooks describe is physically real and achievable, if brutally labor-intensive. That's an important thing to establish clearly, because a lot of internet claims about impossible ancient stonework skip right past the fact that serious experimental testing already backs up big parts of the conventional account. But confirming the basic method doesn't close every question, and this is where it gets genuinely interesting instead of settled. Pounding granite with dolerite is a slow, rough process. It removes material in a controlled but coarse way, well suited to roughly shaping a block or dressing a flat surface. It's less obviously suited to some of the finer, more precise features that show up on Egyptian granite objects: narrow drilled cores, straight parallel saw-like channels, and interior surfaces on sarcophagi and vessels that come out remarkably flat and even. For those, the evidence points to a second toolkit, entirely copper tubes and copper saw blades, used not to cut the granite directly, but to drag hard abrasive sand, likely quartz sand, across the stone's surface. The copper itself does almost no cutting. It's essentially a soft carrier dragging a harder grit back and forth or around in a circle, slowly grinding a channel or a hole. This is documented directly. The British Egyptologist Flinders Petrie, working in the 1880s, recovered ancient granite drill cores at Giza, showing fine spiral striations on their surfaces, consistent exactly with abrasive-assisted tube drilling rather than a solid metal drill bit cutting through stone on its own. Those cores are real, physical, catalogued objects, not a theory, an artifact you can go look at. So here's the honest, unglamorous version of how this actually worked: dolerite pounders for rough shaping and dressing large surfaces, and copper tools plus abrasive sand for finer drilling and sawing. It's not a single elegant technique, it's a toolkit, refined over centuries, that traded speed for scale. This was not fast work. Modern estimates for a project like the Unfinished Obelisk suggest a workforce numbering in the thousands, laboring for months or, more likely, years to free a single block this size from the bedrock. Which brings us back to the obelisk itself. Because this is where the real, still open mystery lives, not in how the technique worked, but in why this specific piece of work stopped. The Unfinished Obelisk lies in a quarry a short distance from Aswan, still attached on its underside to the natural bedrock, exactly the way it was left. If it had been completed, detached, transported, and raised, it would have stood around 42 meters tall and weighed in the neighborhood of 1,090 tons, significantly larger than any obelisk ancient Egypt ever successfully erected. The scale of the attempt alone tells you something about the ambition of whoever commissioned it. Some Egyptologists have connected it, tentatively, to Hatshepsut's reign, though the attribution isn't fully certain. The standard textbook explanation for why work stopped is straightforward: a crack developed in the granite during the carving process, and the crew abandoned the project rather than risk losing months of labor to a block that might shatter under its own weight once freed. That explanation is reasonable on its face. Granite does have natural flaws and internal stress lines, and abandoning a compromised megalith mid-carve rather than continuing to invest labor into a doomed piece is exactly the kind of practical decision you'd expect from an experienced quarrying operation. But when you actually walk the site and look closely at where the tool marks stop relative to where the crack runs, the picture gets a little less tidy than the one-line textbook answer suggests. The visible crack doesn't cleanly mark the exact point where all carving activity ends across the entire object. There are areas where working continued in the vicinity of the flaw rather than immediately upon its discovery. That doesn't disprove the standard explanation. Cracks in a stone this size don't necessarily reveal their full extent immediately, and a crew might reasonably continue working other sections of the obelisk for some time after a fracture was first spotted, hoping it was contained, before finally deciding the whole project was unsalvageable. Egyptologists studying the site generally still favor some version of the crack explanation. What's fair to say honestly is that the precise sequence of events exactly when the crack was noticed, how work continued or didn't around it, and what the final decision-making process looked like isn't fully reconstructed from the physical evidence alone, and probably never will be, since there's no accompanying inscription explaining the decision. What is clear, and worth sitting with, is the sheer scale of sunk cost the ancient Egyptians were willing to walk away from. This wasn't a small misstep. Freeing a block this size involved cutting trenches around its entire perimeter, using exactly the dolerite pounding and abrasive methods just described, across a surface area representing what was likely years of accumulated labor from a large workforce. And they stopped. No salvage attempt to cut it down into a smaller, usable obelisk. No later reuse of the site. It was simply left in the ground, and eventually buried by sand for millennia before modern archaeologists cleared it and made it a visible attraction again. That decision to abandon a project of this magnitude rather than compromise tells you something about how seriously Egyptian builders took structural risk in monuments meant to stand indefinitely. It's worth being straightforward about where the genuinely fringe claims around this site come from, because they do exist, and they're worth naming rather than pretending they don't. Some writers and researchers outside mainstream Egyptology, most prominently the engineer Christopher Dunn, have argued that certain tool marks at Aswan and elsewhere in Egypt are too precise, too uniform, or too smooth to have been produced by the pounding and abrasion toolkit described above, and have proposed instead that some unknown, more advanced cutting technology was involved, sometimes tied to broader claims about a lost earlier civilization. These arguments have not been accepted by mainstream archaeology or geology, and it's worth saying clearly why. The experimental work by Stocks and others has successfully reproduced comparable marks using only the documented ancient toolkit, and no physical evidence, no tool remnants, no material byproducts, no independent corroborating find has ever surfaced to support the existence of more advanced cutting technology at these sites. That doesn't mean every single mark at Aswan has been individually explained to everyone's satisfaction, genuine researchers do still debate the finer points of technique. But the leap from some marks are impressively precise to therefore unknown advanced technology was involved is a leap the physical evidence doesn't currently support. And it's fair to be skeptical of it while still finding the site itself completely fascinating. Because the fascinating part doesn't need the fringe theory at all. What actually sits at Aswan is a civilization that developed a genuinely sophisticated, multi-stage toolkit for working one of the hardest common stones on Earth, using nothing but stone, copper, sand, water, and an enormous, coordinated, sustained human workforce, and then, on at least this one occasion, made the disciplined and costly decision to abandon a flagship project rather than risk it failing after completion. The obelisk that never left the ground is, in a strange way, more informative than one that did. It's a frozen, mid-process snapshot of exactly how this work was done, tool mark by tool mark, that a finished and polished monument would never show you. So here's where this actually stands. The core method, dolerite pounding for shaping, copper and abrasive tools for fine work, is not a mystery. It's documented, tested, and successfully replicated. The precise reason the unfinished obelisk stopped is very likely some version of the crack explanation, though the exact sequence of decisions that led to full abandonment isn't completely nailed down from the physical record alone. And the claims that this required unknown advanced technology don't hold up against the experimental evidence, however striking the tool marks look at first glance. What's real, and what doesn't need any embellishment, is this: somewhere around 3,500 years ago, a workforce of thousands spent what was likely years of labor freeing the largest obelisk ever attempted in Egypt from solid granite bedrock, using tools you could hold in one hand and then, for reasons only partly recoverable today, walked away and left it exactly where it lay. It's still there. You can stand next to it right now, put your hand on the tool marks, and see precisely how far they got before they stopped. If a monument that was never finished tells you more than one that was, there's another site waiting on screen right now where the same thing happened: an ancient project, abandoned mid-work, frozen in the exact moment the builders walked away.